thank you for the opportunity to present at CME, even if our title may give the impression that our work is at odds with this year's theme of renewal. But hopefully I'll be able to dismiss this impression over the next 10 minutes. So today I'm presenting the results of a longitudinal study, which goal was to explore how a program of low-stakes workplace-based assessment was designed, implemented, and modified in 2 Canadian critical care postgraduate training programs, one adult and one pediatric, to support learning and assess competence. For this multiple case study, we use purposive sampling to select hospital sites, faculty, and trainees within each program, and iteratively conducted 2 phases of data collection. We structured this data collection, data set, and data analysis according to pre-specified CBME theoretical assumption and early literature on CBME that actually were focused specifically on engagement and feedback. From these theoretical assumptions, we actually provided some early hypotheses that later align with preliminary findings as part of our study. So we encountered a few unexpected challenges during the study, but end up between 2016 and 2021, conducting 27 single individual interviews of critical care faculty, 19 of them, and 8 residents, as well as 6 direct observation in 1 pediatric ICU and 2 adult ICUs. So we could summarize really our findings on the implementation of a new workplace-based assessment in critical care medicine as the story of building a new house on the same old foundations. So at the beginning of the implementation process, participants readily recognized that the system in place prior to CBME was far from being perfect. Participants therefore perceived programmatic assessment and CBME in general mostly positively and anticipated benefits both for the trainees and for programs, a little bit like a dream house. For example, they thought that workplace-based assessment would allow for more consistent feedback, a little bit as a mandatory pause in the constant flow of clinical busy activities to really get some feedback on their performance. More specifically, participants expected feedback would be more meaningful, i.e. informative and honest, more comprehensive, so meaning a better reflection of all the sets of competencies involved in CCME practice, such as communication skills, and also somehow more inclusive, so that even the most introverted or struggling residents would have equal chance of receiving feedback. The implementation of workplace-based assessment rely on obviously concrete decisions that were made by local critical care programs as guided by Royal College requirements and existing literature. 3 of these decisions stood out in our analysis. First, both local critical care training programs decided on the trainee-led assessment strategies where residents were primarily responsible for seeking feedback from faculty. Faculty were obviously welcomed and maybe expected to provide feedback, but no incentive was actually put in place to favor those behaviors. Both programs also develop workplace-based assessment that assess a range of clinical activities such as resuscitation, family meetings, that really cover broadly relevant competencies. And thirdly, programs planned to monitor faculty and residents' adequate engagement in programmatic assessment through the documentation of the feedback provided on written forms, which were also used for summative decisions about resident progress. So all those decisions were arguably, aligned with the intent of competency by design and made practical sense. However, our interviews and direct observations both indicated that programmatic assessment was not implemented as intended, showing early evidence of structural defects in our medical education system foundation. Trainees described persistent discomfort in asking for assessment, especially trainees who were new to the program or new at a specific training site. Participants also report strategies used by residents to obtain better assessment, including asking for assessment only after the fact when they could assess their own performance, asking feedback from specific faculty who were perceived as kinder or more approachable, or delaying a request for feedback until later in their ICU rotation. In choosing the what, the when, and the by whom of assessment, trainees obviously directly influence the content of assessment obtained from the faculty. In addition, faculty saw value initiating assessment and yet failed to express ownership for assessment activities. Residents confirm that faculty generally lack initiatives in providing formal feedback during clinical activities. Faculty also felt it was important for residents to be in charge of their own learning and therefore acted as follower rather than leader during the assessment process. Participants also reported that not all EPA targets were achieved with the same accuracy. Trainee spoke of the awkwardness of being directly observed in certain clinical activities, whereas faculty expressed serious doubts regarding their own ability to assess softer skills, such as non-procedural skills. As a result, participants felt that the assessment of those non-technical skills was quite challenging in practice, despite the mandate to complete such assessment. Finally, the assessment form elicited mixed feelings amongst participants. Trainee felt the forms played a role purely for program accountability and didn't add any value to the quality of feedback provided. On the contrary, faculty spoke of the assessment form as a useful trigger to provide more structured feedback. And yet they also found the documentation process cumbersome and inherently associated with risk, both for them and for the residents. Participants explained that the ICU context presented specific challenges constraining the implementation of programmatic assessment as planned. Heavy clinical workload, time pressures, cognitive fatigue, limited longitudinal relationship between trainees and faculty, and limited time spent simultaneously by all participants involved in clinical activities outside formal interprofessional rounds or handovers were seen as major limitation. Interestingly, cognitive fatigue was perceived as a barrier as important as time limitation for many participants. So by adopting assessment habits that misalign with the intended goal of the programs, faculty and residents, intentionally or not, contributed to the limited improvement of assessment quality after programmatic assessment implementation. Workplace-based assessment were rapidly and continue to be perceived as dishonest, meaningless, and rarely based on direct observation. Feedback was even less valued for certain clinical activities that were traditionally seldom assessed, and inequities possibly persisted among residents in their ability to obtain meaningful feedback. So in summary, participants saw value in competency-based medical education, and programs made implementation choices align with the philosophy behind competency by design. But these choices, combined to certain ICU contextual factors, cause participants to adopt pernicious assessment behaviors that led to contrived form of engagement and distorted quality of feedback. Such effect led participants to perceive assessment as meaningless, creating a vicious circle of the adoption of further counterproductive assessment behavior and a global reassessment of the value of CBME. We would argue that our findings, however, do not indicate initially a problem with the fundamental principle behind CBME or with the design of the new house, but rather with some fundamental issues in our medical education systems, the weak or defective foundations that are left unaddressed by the construction of a new house. The big gray box here that lay in the background of this assessment process. So which factor contributed to these weak foundations? Well, those issues are not new or dramatically surprising, but have yet to be addressed head-on by educators and program. Deeply ingrained fear of providing or receiving constructive feedback because of a range of reasons that are now well described in the literature. Value of medical education within critical care medicine, where relatively few numbers of educators and teachers support a complex assessment system, where limited faculty development opportunities exist, and therefore limited spontaneous engagement of faculty in assessment activities persist. In a challenging ICU environment which vulnerabilities have been further highlighted recently during the COVID pandemic, and where staff emotional and physical survival is as much at stake than patient survivals on many clinical days. So how do we rebuild those foundations? Probably by thinking a bit more boldly and creatively about assessment in the ICU context, and consider solutions such as dedicated formative assessors that are not supervising clinicians, that are not involved in summative assessment, and that are not trained with a 2-hour workshop. Also possibly with forms that shockingly do nothing else than documenting the occurrence of an assessment encounter, without numbers, without comments, without scales, without check marks, possibly accompanied by other summative assessment activities where performance is then marked and reported back to competence committee. So based on these implications, we see our work as an opportunity to pause, review, and renew the implementation of CBME within critical care medicine, and therefore goals that very much align with this year's conference theme. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to further discuss our results with you. Thank you.